In this video, we'll go over heavily played cards that have effects that almost never get used, and people probably forgot are part of the original cards. And at number 10, we have number 39, Utopia. This is a heavily played Xyz monster who's most commonly used in order to rank up into Utopia Double, or Utopia the Lightning. And the original card itself rarely gets used for its effect, but it is used sometimes and everyone knows what it does. If a monster declares an attack, you can detach one of its Xyz materials to negate that attack. However, since this card rarely lives long enough to lose all of its materials, most players probably forget that it has an extra effect, where if this card is targeted for an attack while it has no Xyz materials, this card destroys itself. And since this card is generally just used as the start of a combo in order to go into the Lightning or Utopia Double, it almost never gets to stick around long enough for that effect to matter. But it is a pretty minor thing. It's more like one of its drawbacks that you almost never have to worry about, which is why it only takes number 10 spot on this list. But when I was researching this video, I had completely forgotten about that last effect, so I'm sure some of you probably did as well. And at number 9, we have the Winged Dragon of Ra, Sphere Mode. Now, I'm sure most people do know what this card's second effect is, it's just it almost never gets used in competitive play. This card is a very heavily played side deck edition because it has the ability to tribute 3 of your opponent's monsters in order to normal summon it to your opponent's side of the field, where it can't be targeted for attacks or card effects. And its other effect allows you to tribute this card in order to special summon the Winged Dragon of Ra from your hand or deck, ignoring its summoning conditions, and then setting its attack and defense to 4,000. Now, seeing as the god cards are pretty popular in the Yu-Gi-Oh community, this effect isn't super not well known, but is a good example of what the kinds of cards on this list are like. Cards which are heavily used for one of their effects, and almost never used for their other ones. Like how this card can special summon a 4K beat stick straight from your deck, and it's never used for that effect because its effect to tribute 3 of your opponent's monsters is just so much better. And at number 8, we have Elder Entity Natis. This card is very commonly played for its effect that activates when it's sent to the graveyard, where you get to destroy one card on the field. So if you're using a card that allows you to send monsters from your extra deck directly to the graveyard, this card is an excellent target for stuff like Infernoid Tiara, and is basically a staple addition in Infernoid decks because of its floating effect. So it almost never actually hits the field because it's honestly kind of hard to special summon. This card cannot be summoned through normal polymerization spell cards, and must be special summoned by using a combination of Synchro and Xyz monsters as its 2 materials. And while this card is on the field, it has an effect where once per turn, you can special summon a level 4 or lower monster from your hand. This card was supposed to be a nerfed version of Elder Entity Norden, who could special summon a monster from the graveyard on its special summon. So this one only brings out a card from your hand. Although since this card is almost exclusively used for its floating effect, I'm sure most people don't even know what its on-field effect even is. And at number 7, we have Wavering Eyes. This card was so good back before Master Rule 4 that it was actually banned for a while, as it has the effect to destroy all cards in the pendulum zones, and then it applies its effects based on the amount of cards you destroyed with its effect. And the main use of this card was to destroy your opponent's pendulum scales in order to use its number 2 effect. That allowed you to add a pendulum monster from your deck to your hand, which essentially turns this card into a +2 in card advantage, with even more advantage if you're able to destroy your own scales as well, which pendulum decks love to do, where you could also banish another card on the field, and if you destroyed 4 cards, you could add another copy of this card from your deck to your hand. However, this card does have one little minor effect that most people forget is included in it, where if you only destroy 1 card, you just inflict 500 points of burn damage to your opponent, which is such a minor amount in comparison to all the other good effects this card does, that it's easy to forget that this card's entire effect can be negated by a Perform Mage damage juggler. Because you see, since this card can inflict burn damage, it can be countered by cards which negate burn damage. And Perform Mage Damage Juggler is a pretty good card, part of an engine that's played in a lot of decks, which has a hand effect that allows you to discard this card in order to negate the activation and destroy a card which has an effect that would inflict damage. Which is kind of funny that a card which has the potential to allow you to go +4 in card advantage can be stopped by a combo extender, who has a niche second effect that almost never comes into play, because so few meta decks try to inflict burn damage as part of their strategy. And at number 6, we have Heroic Challenger Thousand Blades. This card has a very useful effect in the graveyard, where once per turn if you take damage, you can special summon this card from the graveyard in attack position. So this card was heavily played in the past with Performage Trick Clown, who could special summon itself when it was sent to the graveyard but made you take 1000 burn damage as a cost, which would activate the effect of Thousand Blades to bring it out as well. And so Thousand Blades was used very heavily in all kinds of decks that love to put a whole bunch of monsters into the graveyard, since you can get out a free monster once during each player's turn. And this card also had another effect tied to its archetype, which is almost never used. And it's actually a pretty decent one too, where once per turn you can discard a heroic card to special summon a heroic monster from your deck. Although you can't special summon any other monsters a turn you activate this effect except heroic monsters, which I guess makes it not that good. There aren't a lot of good heroic extra deck monsters. But since this effect is tied exclusively to its archetype, which is almost never played alongside this card, it's real easy to forget that half of the text of this card is dedicated to its other lesser used effect. And at number 5, we have Black Rose Dragon. This is another card that was on the ban list for a long time because it had such a great first effect, where when this card is synchro summoned, you can destroy all cards on the field, which does include itself sadly. So there was a very good combo deck in the synchro era, where players would use Debris Dragon alongside Dandelion in order to perform a 1-card Black Rose Dragon synchro summon to destroy all the cards on the field, and then end with 2 tokens with Dandelion. And Crystron decks love to use Black Rose Dragon during your opponent's turn, since they're all about synchro summoning during your opponent's turn, which means Black Rose Dragon could kind of be used as disruption to blow up all your opponent's cards. And Black Rose Dragon also has this second other effect, where you can banish a plant monster from your graveyard in order to target a defense position monster your opponent controls, which will change that monster to attack position and set its attack to 0 until the end of the turn. And this second effect is alright. It could allow you to attack over something for 2400 points of damage, but not a lot of decks leave a whole bunch of monsters in defense position, and link monsters can't even go into defense position, so it's an incredibly situationally useful effect. And since Black Rose Dragon's most useful application is destroying itself as soon as it hits the field, this is probably one of the most forgotten second effects on a monster, which I only have at a middle spot on this list because the top 4 cards are just better cards who also happen to have forgotten effects. And at number 4, we have Raidraptor Ultimate Falcon, a card which has 2 extra effects that are often forgotten about. And by that I mean I forgot about them when I was specifically talking about their extra effects in a past video. You see, this card is one of the best targets to cheat out of the extra deck with something like Waking the Dragon, since it's a 3500 attack beatstick who's just passively unaffected by all card effects, which is the best form of protection in the game. And since it has such a high attack power value as well, this card can just straight up win you the game against certain decks, that your opponent just won't be able to destroy it. And since this card is so often cheated out of the extra deck, it never actually has any Xyz materials attached to it, so there's no need to learn what its other effects are, which require you to detach or have Xyz materials to use them. But what this card does is, if you bring this card out normally, is you can detach one of its materials in order to make it so that, until the end of the turn, all monsters your opponent controls lose 1000 attack. And your opponent can't activate cards or their effects, which is a not half bad lockdown, and will allow your other cards to beat over your opponent's monsters most of the time. It also has a third effect, where if it has a Raidraptor Xyz material attached to it, once per turn during the end phase, you can make all your opponent's monsters lose 1000 attack permanently. And if your opponent doesn't control any monsters that are face up, you instead get to inflict 1000 burn damage. Now, these effects aren't half bad. Both require the card to have Xyz materials to even use them, so I've never seen anyone use this card's actual effects before. And in a previous video, when I was talking about this card's other effects, I completely forgot about its third effect, even though this card comes up so frequently in a lot of my other videos. Generally, cards that are good and used a lot will show up in a lot of different kinds of my top 10s, which definitely includes Ultimate Falcon. And at number 3, we have Macro Cosmos. This is a really good floodgate, which is currently limited to 1 copy per deck, that has the effect that while this card is face up on the field, all cards are banished instead of going to the graveyard. And since so many decks use the graveyard as a second hand, basically, this card is completely devastating against a lot of meta decks, and can single-handedly win you the game if your opponent can't remove it, which is kind of why this card got limited to 1 copy. It was just too good, and can completely one-sidedly shut down your opponent if you played a deck which didn't care about your graveyard or wanted your cards banished. I remember when I first got back into the game after high school, I took my Macro Monarch deck to a local event and managed to win half my games because of Macrocosmos and Dimensional Fissure just being such good floodgates. Despite the fact that I had no idea what half of my opponent's cards were doing, I did know that them being banished totally screwed their strategies over. And Macrocosmos has an additional effect, where when this card is activated, you can special summon a monster from your deck. Specifically, Helios, the Primordial Sun, which is a terrible level 4 monster with no stats that only gains 100 attack and defense for each of your banished monsters. Although it could potentially be a free card on the field if you needed it for something, so I played it in my Macro Monarch deck, but pretty much every other deck didn't want that card, and they just wanted it for its floodgate effect. But because of this extra effect, Macrocosmos can actually be negated by Solemn Warning, which is a card that can negate the effects of a card that would special summon a monster. So even if you don't have Helios in your deck, you could still use Solemn Warning to negate and destroy that Macrocosmos, which was a pretty popular interaction back in the day, all because this card had an extra effect that no one used. And at number 2, we have Brilliant Fusion. This is a continuous spell card that is currently banned for being way too good of a combo extender, and allowing you to gain an additional normal summon with its interactions with Gem Knight Seraphonite. As what this card does is it allows you to fusion summon a Gem Knight monster by using materials from your deck, and since Seraphonite just requires a Gem Knight monster and a light monster, you could send something like Perform H Trick Clown to the graveyard in order to get 2 monsters on the field from only 1 card in your hand. And Seraphonite would also give you an extra normal summon, which gave all kinds of benefits to decks, because most meta decks are balanced around the fact that they only have 1 normal summon per turn. So they generally play very strong cards that can take advantage of that 1 normal summon, and the amount of advantage you can get with a single Brilliant Fusion basically coined the term Garnet as a monster that's useless in your hand and you want in your deck, because everybody was playing Brilliant Fusion and Gem Knight Garnet as their 1 Gem Knight monster they needed in order to actually use its effect. But Brilliant Fusion also has this other effect that no one ever used, where the monster it brought out would have 0 attack and defense, everybody knew about that effect, but Brilliant Fusion also had this effect on the field, where once per turn you could discard 1 spell card in order to make it so that the fusion monster brought out would gain its attack and defense back until the end of the turn. So the downside of playing Brilliant Fusion was supposed to be the fact that the monster you brought out would have no stats, and you'd have to discard an extra card in order to use it to its full potential. Although everyone just kind of used Seraphonite as a combo piece for other extra deck monsters, so that was never a restriction to the card. And a lot of people probably forgot that you could even make the card's attack and defense equal to their original if they just discarded a spell card with Brilliant Fusion. And at number 1, we have Tellarknight Ptolemaeus. This card got banned really quickly after it came out because it could be used to rank up into rank 5 Xyz monsters which didn't have a number in its name, and would transfer all of its remaining Xyz material to that card, at the cost of detaching 3 of its materials. So the best way to use this card was to go into Cyber Dragon Nova. That way you could rank it up into Cyber Dragon Infinity, which is a super good monster that can absorb one of your opponent's monsters into it and has a once per turn Omni negate. And since Tellarknight Ptolemaeus allowed rank 4 spam decks to go into Cyber Dragon Infinity so easily, this card got banned because that was just a little bit too good, and gave so much more power to the rank 4 engine than it already had, since it was already one of the best ranks to go into. Now, Ptolemaeus also has another effect that almost never gets used because it's probably just a gimmick, but it is technically one of the strongest effects in the game, where its other effect is the ability to skip your opponent's next turn. But you can only do this if this card has 7 Xyz materials, and when this card came out, you could only have 5 monsters in the field at a time, so the only way to accomplish this goal was to use another card to give this card Xyz materials. This card could use 2 or more monsters in order to bring it out, so you could start off with 5 materials if you had 5 level 4 monsters. And it has another effect, where during each player's end phase, you can attach 1 Tellarknight card from your extra deck to this monster as an Xyz material. So if you brought this card out with its 5 materials, and then waited until your next turn, that would be 2 end phases passing, which would give you 7 materials needed in order to skip your opponent's turn. And skipping your opponent's turn can potentially win you the game. That's why the effect is so rare. In fact, I think there's less than 5 cards in the game that have an effect that allow you to skip your opponent's turn. There's not even enough of them to make a top 10 video. And yet this banned card has that super rare effect, which people probably forgot about because it was never used for that, and instead was used for its other broken effect that allowed it to rank up into monsters during either player's turn. Alright, and that's the video. Do you know of any other cards which have second effects that are almost never used? If so, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments for potential part 2 to this video on the same subject. And fun fact, did you know almost everyone who watches these videos forgets to subscribe to the channel afterwards?